I guess for me, knowledge just is inseparable from communication. And so if I'm not trying to express ideas in dialogue with others, I feel like I can't really know anything. I wished I had had more time with Wolfgang to dig into that, because I think he's both positively influenced by Whitehead, and particularly Whitehead's idea of the bifurcation of nature between the sort of quantitative approach of the empirical sciences, which develop these mathematical models of the so-called primary characteristics, and then the all of the what Whitehead called the psychic additions that, from a materialist point of view, would be dismissed as just secondary characteristics that are the qualitative aspects that are just in the mind, and the mind is epiphenomenal. And that whole bifurcated pictures something Whitehead rejects, and Wolfgang clearly rejected that as well. But then there's a very important difference between Wolfgang's approach, which is I think more in line with the kind of emanationist scheme, say coming out of Plotinus or Plato, or this perennial tradition, where this idea of evolution, which is so important for Whitehead, is, I think for Wolfgang, could only ever be a kind of appearance, mere appearance. Time and history are, and the sort of creative unfolding of novelty, as Whitehead would describe it. It seems to me Wolfgang would say that that's could only ever be a kind of Maya, because what's real is this one eternal underlying wholeness. See, Whitehead's never denying that, but he's trying to, I think, Whitehead's a pluralist, he says, not because he denies unity, but he's trying to allow for manyness and oneness to have some kind of parity, and that the many is not opposed to the one. And I know there's a way in which one could read this Platonist and Neoplatonist understanding of the one as also inclusive of the many. But Whitehead really does emphasize process, and he's trying to throw the one and the many into a creative advance where, yes, eternity is with us and fully present in each moment, but also each moment is new, and something is evolving, something is unfolding. And for Whitehead, even the divine doesn't know what's going to happen next. And so there's an element of the temporal that I think, and the evolutionary that Whitehead wanted to preserve. And this is an evolution that's very different from Darwin's, and especially the neo-Darwinian picture of evolution, which I know Wolfgang had a lot of criticisms of, and I share his criticisms of that. But I think there's a deeper form of evolution that's not just that specific scientific paradigm that Wolfgang rightly criticizes. So yeah, I think that's the basic difference, right? And maybe there are others too, but that's the one that immediately comes to mind. And Wolfgang and I did touch on this a bit towards the end of our conversation, but I wished I could have gone a little bit deeper with him. Because he's Catholic, right? And so history has to be really important. The Bible is an account of a historical process. Whitehead develops this whole elaborate metaphysical scheme with all of these different concepts and categories, like ingression and prehension and concrescence, and so there's a lot there to unpack in order to really understand what he's talking about, as there is with Wolfgang's work and what's meant by vertical causation. But I think in an effort to bring forms of causality, and namely formal causality itself, back into the scientific picture, we're going to need to speak in a new way. And so, the modern scientific paradigm has been primarily mechanistic, and so has only allowed efficient causation, which is a kind of, you could say, like push from behind type of causality, which is deterministic, horizontal causality. And this is a reaction against, this more medieval scholastic or Aristotelian understanding, where nature is, yes, there are efficient causes, but there are also formal and final causes, which is to say, the shape and the morphology of things plays a role in what happens, and isn't simply reducible to efficient or horizontal causality. And similarly, these shapes are have a reason. They're purposefully shaped and actively engaged in the realization of some kind of aim or value. And the modern scientific view had to stuff all that stuff, form or ideas and purposes, stuff it all into the human soul, and leave nature just naked mechanism. And what quantum physics is suggesting, what the complexity sciences are suggesting, is that we actually can't understand nature. Like, we tried to apply the mechanistic paradigm as rigorously as we possibly could, and we ended up discovering non-local entanglement, right? And so how do you explain that mechanistically? Well, you can talk about hidden variables and try to do a move like David Bohm, and maintain a kind of holistic determinism, ultimately, unbroken wholeness at the global scale. Or you can talk about vertical causality in Wolfgang's sense. But what Whitehead ends up trying to do is rather than emphasizing the wholeness of the totality or the universe at the macro scale, he also wants to emphasize the wholeness of each individual actual occasion. And so, in other words, if the infinite, the genuinely infinite, is not separate from the finite. And so, in Whitehead's view, each of the particulars, so-called, contains the entirety of the universe. Right? Every actual occasion physically prehends the entirety of the past, and conceptually prehends everything that remains possible in relationship to that past. And so, in a way, Whitehead's taking this emanationist emphasis on the one that you find in Neoplatonism, and he's inserting it into each of the many, and allowing for this recapitulation of oneness in each of the particulars, so as to give rise to an evolutionary cosmology that's also constantly reuniting itself with that macroscopic whole, but doing so in a way that adds to or allows for the growth of that one, right? And so Whitehead would talk about not so much vertical causation as he would the ingression of eternal objects, I think would be the closest equivalent in Whitehead, which is the way in which each of these unique particular occasions of experience is relating to the one eternal truth, right? We relate to that through this, what Whitehead calls ingression, which is in a way our participation in the eternal. But we're always participating in the eternal from a new perspective, moment by moment. And Whitehead wants to say our decisions are feeding back on that eternal realm and allowing it to grow, so that it's not simply a static eternity, it's a living eternity. So that's very condensed, but I think it's my attempt to begin to articulate the different, there's a shared goal between what Wolfgang was attempting with his idea and what Whitehead's attempting, but I think they have a different emphasis, at least, if not some more underlying fundamental difference. It's at least a different emphasis. I love wisdom, I guess, and that's a path that began for me. High school, really, in a conscious way in high school. And, I think I was always a quiet, reflective kid, but I knew pretty early on. Well, before my senior year of high school, I was pretty convinced I was going to be a professional hockey player. But I stopped growing. At about 14 and peaked at about 5'5", and so it wasn't going to be in the cards. But luckily, I started to like reading, and discovered this I remember realizing at some point early on, maybe junior or senior in high school, and reading different books that in psychology and philosophy, like there's this whole story, this whole history that would provide context for the ideas that I'm reading. Because when you first start getting into philosophy, it's daunting. It's like, what the hell are these people talking about? But you read a little bit more about the ideas that are in the background of an idea you just read about, and then like this whole thread, you discover this thread that you begin to pull on, and eventually, I had read 4 or 5 different histories of Western philosophy, and then I realized there's Asia and all of those traditions that go back even further, and I think I just got addicted on some level to understanding and the infinite context of language, and I love reading. I feel like I love reading even more today because of the way that the human attention span is such an endangered species right now, and I feel like those of us who like reading have a duty to preserve it and to try to convince others that it's worth preserving. So it just feels like more important. It's not just me at home on my couch reading a book. It's like an active cognitive resistance. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I just can't help myself. Well, the problem is that we, at least intellectuals in the modern period, came to inhabit a toy model version of the universe that we thought it was mechanistic, and then quantum physics showed that it couldn't possibly be like simply located particles banging into each other. And it's like we had to rediscover through quantum physics what we should have already known experientially, that we live in a relational participatory universe. And so, Whitehead's cosmology would be allowing us to look again at our experience to see, of course we would discover something like quantum physics, because all our experience overlaps. Our experience is imbued with possibility moment by moment. And the way Whitehead would describe the situation that in terms of what's measurable, what's computable versus the measurer. I mean, he talks about 2 kinds of analysis. What he calls coordinate analysis, which is what physics does. It measures things and it turns them into data streams, information. And that information is always going to be an approximation of what's really going on. It's always as if, because what it's doing is removing ourselves as observers from the system we're trying to measure, while also implicitly assuming that there's a perspective from which we could measure. And so rather than be naive about what science is doing, Whitehead develops an ontology where observers are part of the universe. But there's a different kind of analysis when we shift over from what can be measured to the measurer, if you will. We need to do what he calls genetic analysis, because now we're talking about, like, for him, the process of concrescence, which is how each moment of experience actualizes itself. And concrescence takes place in this, you could call it a space of possibility, where there's nothing determinate yet that could be measured. There's a process unfolding where we're bringing infinitely many feelings from the past and from this realm of possibilities he calls the realm of eternal objects or Platonic forms. We're bringing conceptual feelings of those forms and physical feelings of the past, and we're coalescing them together and making a decision about what would be the most intense form of experience that could be realized, right? And so, given this situation, but if we're gonna understand something like consciousness or experience or the person, we can't use Whitehead or Whiteheadian physicists like Timothy Eastman, for example, would distinguish between Boolean and non-Boolean forms of analysis, which is equivalent to Whitehead's coordinate analysis of the Boolean. In other words, the binary, that 1 or 0, like we can reduce it to some measurement in terms of its information content, versus the non-Boolean, which is what's going on inside of concrescence. It's an aesthetic process, not something that could be quantified and measured. And so we have to then, in this picture, understand physical science as always an approximation. So what can be computed is always going to be an approximation of what's going on. And we can use our models of what can be computed and measured to make predictions about the future. And as long as we assume that the general environment within which we're measuring and making predictions stays the same, then those scientific models will be accurate. But the thing is, we know in advance that the universe is going to continue to evolve. Those environmental conditions are going to change, and so none of our models, we should never fall into the mistake or the fallacy of imagining that one of our scientific models is the final answer. Even if it's highly accurate, the universe will, the very laws of physics will continue to evolve in Whitehead's picture, because what's truly real is this process of concrescence, which is a process whereby novelty is produced moment by moment, right? And it's an immeasurable, infinite process. I think there's a way in which modern science and its observer-independent view comes right out of medieval Catholic scholastic theology. It's a particular image of God as separate from the world. Thomas Aquinas is the great synthetic integrative thinker who brings Aristotelian science and Christian theology into a really beautiful system. And I think we still have a lot to learn from Aquinas, and he has a whole conception of epistemology that's embodied in participatory that I think we can still learn so much from. But there's Aquinas is it's deep and rich, but there's a broader conception coming out of medieval theology of an all-powerful God that is separate from the universe and created the universe in a rational way. And all the modern scientists in the 17th century assumed this view, and it's a kind of deism, and it's really the only reason that they would even have this seemingly absurd idea that nature obeys these laws, these precise mathematical laws that we as human beings can decode, right? Because the creator of our soul and the creator of this, rational, law-abiding world is the same creator. That's the fundamental ontotheological and epistemological basis of modern science. A few centuries later, that background, the theological background of modern science, gets forgotten and elided, and so science rests on some kind of absurd foundation, we don't know why the universe is intelligible, we don't know why we're intelligent, but here we are, let's do science. But I think there's a way in which this participatory view that I hear you speaking to, we can apply it in science as well. But to apply it in science, we have to also apply it in theology first. And a more participatory theology, I think, has a lot to do with understanding the incarnation, where, you can think of a creator God as the author of the cosmic novel, and we're, characters in that novel as human beings. And theologians are trying to be not just characters, but readers of the story, and philosophers too. We want to step back a little bit out of our just self-interest as characters within the story and see the story as a whole. It doesn't make us the creator of the story, but we're at least a reader and not just a character in it. But what happens with the incarnation is the author of the story all of a sudden decides to become one of the characters in the story. Not just a character, but it's some integration of the author and the character. And all of a sudden, one of the characters in the story is talking to the other characters hey, I wrote all this. And so, but that's a fundamental transformation in the nature of the divine, which also fundamentally transforms the creation. And I think God's no longer a creator anymore, or at least not just a creator. God has become a creature also, not instead of, but also. And it also makes the human being into more than just a creature as well, right? And so, when I think about, you mentioned wanting to reconnect with a kind of pre-Cartesian understanding of the human being, and I certainly would agree that we need to move beyond the Cartesian view. But I wonder if there might be some difference between trying to undo it and return to a time before Descartes versus trying to go through Descartes to some other transformed way of being. And the way that modern individualism and the emphasis on values of democracy and this secular sense of being freed from what became considered to be a kind of suffocating sacredness. The individual wanted to discover their own sense of values, and that starts initially with Protestantism, but then it just leaves religion behind entirely and becomes more about the self. And there's so many ways in which what modern science did is take this observer-independent God's eye view that's God's and appropriate it for the human being to say, oh, no, now we are the observer-independent, prospectors of the universe. And modern individualism is in some sense the deification of the ego, of the self. And I think, but at the same time, individual freedom, these democratic values are essential for a pluralistic world. And I mean, the Catholic Church is huge. 1 billion Catholics, is that something? And it's quite diverse, and so it's universal in the sense that it includes these cultural differences within it, and ethnic, and so there's real potential there, and I think, but there's even more diversity than that. I mean, there's so many non-theistic traditions, and there's the Islamic world, and so one of the things you mentioned. Rudolf Steiner, and I see him at anthroposophy as an example of trying to preserve the sense of communal bonds and like that we really are members of the body of God. At the same time that we allow for there to be many different ways for different human communities to perform that communion and maintain that communion, and that we can, when it comes to the laws that govern our political relationships, I think the founders of the United States were quite wise in saying, those should be determined in as secular a way as we can, and we're going to, of course, need the church communities to give us a sense of deep values and morality and whatnot. Like, the state can't provide that, but the state shouldn't arrive at its laws based on any particular religious viewpoint, because we have multiple religions here. Well, we have capitalism, which is, it's become our moral compass, right? It's individualism without any kind of sacred backdrop, or at least the sacred has been replaced with wealth. And so Catholic social teaching, I think Catholic social teaching is so important right now. And I also, I don't know, I wonder how you feel about Pope Francis, but what he's done to speak to the ecological relevance of a biblical worldview, I think, and giving new interpretation to what environmental ethicists and philosophers and theologians have always, ego-theologians at least, have critiqued is the dominion clause in Genesis that just gives human beings the right to, seemingly, some would say, do whatever we want with creation, instead of being, tasked by God with maintaining its vitality and goodness, and stewards, not owners. I mean, I would say there's something compelling about the enduring vitality of the church after all of these centuries, but also what so speaks to me about the Christ event is how that entanglement actually spills out beyond any institutional walls. And so there is no human institution. I ran from church life, from my mom's way of relating to the Bible as a teenager, and became a Buddhist, and really turned east and got into Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki and all that, and then I had an experience of Christ that changed me. It didn't bring me to a church, but it did bring me to the Christ within myself and within others. And yeah, I've sought for an institutional home. I haven't found one. I mean, within Christianity proper, Catholic, Episcopal, Unitarian even, which the closest there, but that's so watered down. It's like, I don't know. But anthroposophy, I went to the Gratianum and was hoping to find something there in Dornach, Switzerland. And for me, it was too religious too, in the sense of there are certain dogmatisms that have taken root even in this organization, this Anthroposophical Society, that was founded by someone who said, this is a science, don't take my word for it, practice, see what you can see. But inevitably, he saw so much that was so compelling, everybody just repeats what he said. So I haven't found a place that I can call home yet, other than just the wilds of human interaction more broadly. And if I were, I think the closest thing I have to church right now is a group that I meet with every Friday morning, to talk about the human condition and our relationship to the divine. And I wish I did it in person. It's on Zoom, but people all over the world. But I think ideally, a one way to revitalize this connection to the Spirit, like to the Holy Spirit, would be to just have, a cathedral. I mean, sacred architecture is so important for getting you in the mood to commune. But I think we can also have church in someone's living room, with tea and just talking to each other about how our personal problems relate to the deeper spiritual source of things. Technological evolution and the shift in media communication technologies, I think, is so important. And McLuhan, a Catholic, by the way, was so hip to this. I mean, what really was the first major challenge to the power of the Catholic Church? The printing press, which you couldn't have had the Protestant, Reformation without that, to translate the Bible out of Latin into the vernaculars. And I think similarly, radio, it's not that radio caused fascism, but without the radio, you can't have the Führer. Like the Nazi Party, as soon as they took power, they manufactured this radio that they made sure was in everyone's living room, so that like Hitler could communicate directly and they could have this mystical communion with their leader. Similarly, with the television and these images coming back from Vietnam, like the anti-war movement, I think was catalyzed, not caused. This isn't reductionistic, but to see these images being backed into people's living rooms of the carnage going on, I think did inspire the anti-war movement. We all know and love and hate what social media has done to our politics and to our discourse. But there are real transformations in the very basis of the very phenomenological structure of human consciousness that results from the adoption, the widespread adoption of these technologies. And it, the alphabet, I think, is so important for there to even be a Bible, and for these stories to be written down and for the Bible to become a great code for the construction of a certain kind of civilization. This all rests on this communication technology. The alphabet was originally invented, though, for economic reasons by the Phoenicians, and then gets adapted for these other purposes. And to go from the alphabet to the printing press, to the telegraph, to the radio, to the television, to the internet, these are epical shifts in maybe not human nature so much, but definitely in reshaping the structure of human consciousness and our relationships to one another. And, McLuhan, I think, speaks to this in a way that makes it very relevant to what we might mean by the mystical body of Christ. He saw the internet coming and what electronic media would do to our culture. And as did Steiner, Teilhard de Chardin as well, another Catholic who I know Wolfgang was not too keen on. But there's ways of understanding this technological evolution as, I would almost describe it as a kind of, you could say it's like the gradual incarnation of the Logos, transforming the physical world into a more fluid medium for the conveyance of spirit. And this gets really esoteric, but I think the story of the serpent in the garden is in some sense the story of the role that technology plays in human life, right? But the thing is, how do we read that story of the Garden of Eden and Eve being tempted by the serpent and eating the apple? I think, can we really say that an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God wouldn't have kind of needed or wanted or somehow foreseen that we were going to eat that apple? And so this journey of technological evolution, co-evolution between humans and technology, I think is part of the sacred history that we cannot but participate in. And so we can't just reject technology. I mean, there's much that we must resist in the temptation that it breeds in us to become distracted from the task, the sacred task. But I think the tools are here to help us. But and again, I think he had too narrow a conception of evolution to reduce it to just that, because that's not Teilhard's view of evolution. It's not Brian Swim or Thomas Berry's view of evolution. But it is religious. It is an evolutionary spirituality. But I think it's like, it's like, instead of having to choose between creationism and evolution, I would want a creative evolution. Like we can have an integration of these perspectives and grant that there's something but there's evolutionary theory is a theology, and so, but it's like somewhere between science and religion, right? And I think we really need to seek these integrative points of view, and like, rather than just saying science will always be observer independent, can we have a participatory science? Can we have a science that recognizes that human personhood is at the base of, is the epistemological and ontological presupposition of science, that it's like we can do science because of the nature of human personhood, and that human personhood isn't just something we might explain scientifically. No. We explain science because there's human personhood. I would put it that way. But rather than having science and religion be at odds with each other, or evolution and a view of the universe or creation as being somehow divinely inspired, like, I really think our task is to integrate these things. And I think Teilhard goes a long way towards doing that. I have problems with Teilhard too, but I don't know that it's helpful. I mean, one of the things that I really found, I'll say, and disappointing about Wolfgang's view is that he would say that Teilhard was possessed by evil. Like, he literally said that, and I find that unfortunate and short-sighted, because for me, what would bring me back to taking the Catholic vision of things seriously would be someone like Teilhard, or his influences like Thomas Berry. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Thomas Berry. He was a Catholic Passionist monk and philosopher. That's what would bring me back, would be that kind of integration. Well, I mean, Thomas Aquinas was almost put on, or maybe one of his books was put on the index initially, right? And so, there's a way in which the church has, and there are ideas in the church fathers, like Origen, about like reincarnation and apokatastasis, if I'm pronouncing that right. Everyone is saved in the end, even Satan, that didn't become part of, the Catholic doctrine, but that I really find really important ideas. And so, but, a process, relational worldview and philosophy does bias us towards novelty. But the thing about novelty is it's always renovation. It's never just creation from nothing. And so you're working with the material at hand, you're working with what you inherit. But the thing is, whatever we inherit, it's never going to be the same twice, because we're always interpreting it from an ever-renewed present. And so I would expect that the Catholic Church will continue to evolve, and that Christianity, that Christianity will continue to evolve. And there's something, and he's not the only one that says this, but something that Steiner says that I really take to heart, which is that we're only just beginning to see the historical impact of the Christ event. Yeah, it's been 2,000 years, but it's just beginning. This is an epical transformation in the nature of the human being that will continue to unfold for thousands of years. And so what institutional forms end up supporting that ongoing process remains to be seen. I mean, and the Catholic Church it's anti-fragile, to use Nicholas Taleb's term. And so I would expect it'll probably continue to hang around, but it'll change. And other forms of relationship to Christianity that might not even go under that banner will emerge. And I think I want to be open enough to the spirit of this event and this transformation that I would be able to recognize it, even if it were called something else by the communities that were engaged in it, and so know them by their fruits, right? And so we have to remain, I think, sensitive enough to this being that Christians call Christ, borrowing a Greek translation of a Hebrew term, that we want to be universal. And so if we really want it to be universal, we have to be less attached to the names we give it. I'm not a nominalist, right? But I also think when we're dealing with human cultural diversity, like sometimes we translate things differently. And interreligious dialogue is an inevitable part of the future of religion, as far as I'm concerned, which means being able to find ways of maintaining a commitment to a faith that's unique and specific and personal, while also always remaining open to the otherness of those who find a home elsewhere, right? And there's a subtle ethos and I think almost meta faith that one must presuppose for that to even be possible. And we can't speak to what exactly that is, because it's not, I might be able to learn something from a Buddhist, and a Buddhist might be able to learn something from me, but we can't ever characterize what it is that binds us together, other than just to say that we're committed to an openness to the other, And so I think that's what I'm calling interreligious dialogue, and it feels to me like I wouldn't be comfortable just calling myself a follower of Christ unless I were also committed to that kind of pluralism, because I resist the I'm not I don't want to just say there are many paths to the top of the mountain, that old perennialist trope. A teacher of mine and a colleague, Jorge Ferrer, talks about an ocean with many shores as a different kind of metaphor for getting at what this spiritual mystery is that binds different traditions together. But yeah, it's a tension I try to hold, right, between the particularity of my commitment to a historical event and the being who did that deed, while also remaining open to learning from those for whom spirit, for lack of a better word, is described differently. I can't seem to find a way out of that tension. I think of Christ as often playing this mediating role between order and chaos, because you might think, oh, well, Christ is in favor of order, but in his time he was really upsetting the Pharisees and the way that the law was being interpreted and the way that the money changers were in the he was upsetting those who had established the order in Jerusalem, So he's not simply coming to restore order to a chaotic society, to take a step back and look at the way that chaos has been coded, not just by biblical or Abrahamic faiths as evil, but even, I think, by modern secular political and scientific orientations. Chaos is bad. We want to know the laws of physics. We want an ordered society. And so there's this fear around unleashing this dark, unpredictable energy. And I think what process relational thought allows us to do, and this is Whitehead's understanding, is, first of all, there's no such thing as pure chaos, just as there's no such thing as pure order. And instead of coding chaos as evil, we can code chaos as a feminine form of divinity, which is to say, in the biblical, it's in the Bible as Sophia, who was there in the beginning. Nice choice. It's right, there you go. We've got everything we need. But as Sophia, it's like it's the matrix out of which the divine creates, you could say. And so rather than coding chaos as evil, we can code it as the all-nourishing abyss, the womb, what Plato called the receptacle. And what this allows us to it allows us to relate to creativity in a different way, and relate to challenges to establish order in a different way, as not simply evil, but as just a inevitable part of how divine creativity works. And so rather than just talk about the cosmos, I think it was Teilhard who first came up with this term cosmogenesis, in the French equivalent at least. It's like the order by which the universe is created is itself evolving. And so rather than creation being a one-time event, like what the book of Genesis is describing, is a eternal process. That process of creation is still happening. And you could also read it as like, well, the sixth day when God created the human being, God basically handed over the reins of the process of creation to the human and said, okay, now you finish it. So God left it unfinished. And so then the human has to step into the right relationship to the task that God has given to us, by choosing Christ instead of choosing self-aggrandizement or power, which is this temptation. And so chaosmogenesis then is a term, so James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake came up with this term, chaosmos, I believe. And the French post-structuralist philosopher Gilles Deleuze and his psychoanalytic friend Félix Guattari, they use this term as well. And I combined cosmogenesis and chaosmosis, or chaosmos as chaosmogenesis, to signal this new relationship to chaos, not simply as evil, but as a divine consort in a way, and that we can understand the Christ impulse then as a attempt to hold the balance between order and chaos, to find the right middle path whereby we honor creativity while never forgetting the suffering of what's lost in that process, because creation is always destruction, always involves destruction and loss, and the replacing of the old with the new. But I think the Christ impulse is a way of relating to the task of creation lovingly, so that it's not brazen, it's not uncaring creativity that says, screw what's lost. It's a suffering with everything that's lost, and recognizing that we have to move forward as well.